Senator Cotton.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance and your testimony this morning on this important topic. Estimates from a 2015 FDIC survey indicate that 7% of households in our country are unbanked. Another 20% were underbanked, which means they had access to a bank but also used products outside the traditional banking sector. So that's over a quarter of our fellow citizens who don't have the kind of traditional banking relationships that the rest of Americans do. Is it Pascal?
Oh, Pasquale, thank you.
Pasquale.
Yeah.
Apologize. Pascal is how we pronounce it in Arkansas.
Yeah.
Along with other innovative pronunciations of different words. Do you think that the growing fintech market has the potential to help these unbanked and underbanked Arkansans access the digital economy and achieve greater financial security? And if so, please elaborate on how exactly.
You know, I do think that when we look around the world, we've seen fintech used as a tool of financial inclusion. For example, with M-Pesa in Kenya and some other areas around the world, you see an effort there. And I do think that that is, you know, there could be some inspiring opportunities in order to sort of create that sort of tier of opportunity. But I think one of the very difficult questions for senators and for the regulators now is, do you want to create sort of a two-track system, sort of a system that, say, is maybe a higher tier that has higher levels of protection and regulatory standards, and then a lower level, or to what extent we want to maintain sort of a more unitary set of protections? So I do think that, yes, there are definitely global examples of inclusion, but I'm also cautious about, you know, what we might be giving up in order to bring them to the U.S.
What, if anything, is inherent in fintech that would lead to that kind of two-tier system that we should have on our minds as we craft policy?
I think that one of the things is that if you have, for example, fintech firms wanting to avoid, say, consolidated supervision or other sorts of requirements that go along with some of the benefits of, say, certain forms of regulation, that could be one aspect of the problem. But I think the other aspect is that I think sometimes fintech is confused because the term itself leads to confusion, because a lot of the technology ideally would be sort of an adjunct to existing banks that might be required to do what we want them to do in terms of serving the underbanked, as opposed to itself providing those services.
Okay. Mr. Evans, you look like you might have something to add on that point.
Oh, yes. So sorry. Yes, so I was just thinking through some of what Dr. Pasquale was discussing. So certainly I think there are great possibilities in this particular area. Of course, great risks that we detailed in the report, and it's almost too soon to know. We haven't seen a full credit cycle, and we've seen, you know, earlier episodes where we've seen spike in home ownership rates that weren't sustainable, and so we want responsible, sustainable access to credit, and so that are some of the things we need to shake through when we think about marketplace lending.
Mr. Turner, would you like to round out these thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important to note when we're talking about, you know, the unbanked and the underbanked, and when we say fintech can promote inclusion, you know, there are really two parts to that. There is the idea just of access. You know, as we continue to see bank branches closing, it's harder for people to actually have that local bank that they can go to and get financial services. So if we have, you know, mobile applications where people can bank on their phone, I think that's access. And then I think the second part of that is the inclusion that comes with, you know, expanded services that might use alternative data or something like that to make a decision on a loan that a FICO score might not, might show a borrower as a, you know, a risk, where if you include some additional data, you can get a better picture and that person actually can get credit. So I think there's a lot to consider. And I think that, you know, as we move forward and we look at regulation, it is important to remember, and it's important to make sure that fintechs kind of have a framework where, you know, they need to decide, are they going to be deposit-taking institutions and be like a real bank, or are they going to continue as they are now and then need some sort of defined regulatory structure specific to fintechs?
Thank you. Mr. Pasquale, I'd like to look at fintech from another perspective now. We were looking at it from the customer's perspective. Now from the perspective of jobs and investors. CEO of a London-based company called TransferWise recently said that he was recruited by Silicon Valley venture capitalists, but he chose the UK because of their regulatory structure. That's disappointing from the standpoint of American jobs. what, if anything, can we do to prevent future companies from making that decision and seeing the United States as the best, most favorable climate in which to start their companies and create new jobs?
You know, I do think that that the problem of is the U.S. sort of falling behind sort of the awareness of other countries like the UK, that is a key problem. I also would note, though, you know, in terms of the work involved, I think that we do have such a great advantage in terms of some of our sources of strength in Silicon Valley and in New York, in terms of the funding of institutions there, of education and other areas that sort of led to a big advantage there. So I guess my thought would be that I would not necessarily want to see the U.S. regulatory infrastructure be rapidly chipped away at to sort of keep up with this, with, say, what's going on in other countries. But I do think that we should keep in mind that if there's a certain level of divergence, maybe that should lead to some more international cooperation to lead to more convergence, as we were talking earlier with Senator Perdue about some of the Chinese apps.
Thank you. Mr. Turner, Mr. Evans, I regret my time has expired. We would welcome your comments on that question for the record, though. Thank you.
Thank you.